Okay, good morning, everyone. I can't hear myself, but I trust that you all can. Some technical difficulties. Welcome to Doña Ana Community College's Latinx and Hispanic Heritage Month. We're wrapping it up. This is the last week. It will end on Friday on the 15th. But today is Columbus Day, and in some places, Indigenous Peoples Day. New Mexico, along with other places, states and cities, are beginning to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. So when I planned this program, I wanted to highlight, at least today, the correlations or some correlation between Native Americans or Indigenous peoples and in this case, Spanish colonists in North America. So today's presentation, the topic is very broad. So my attempt here is to highlight the interactions, the early interactions and cultural exchanges between the Spanish and Native Americans who lived here primarily in what we know today as the United States and some parts of Mexico. My name is José Aranda. I'm a librarian at DACC. Thank you for joining us. This presentation is being recorded. We do not need you to have your cameras on. And if you have any questions or comments to share, I will pause throughout the presentation and entertain those if I can hear them. If not, please use the chat box. I should have my colleagues, Therese DeSimio and maybe Susan Bontley helping me out. I know Therese is here, so use the chat box for comments or questions. And again, a little bit about myself. I do not claim to be an expert in Native American history, but in my attempts to put on this program, I did solicit experts and made a lot of phone calls and emails, and I didn't get anyone to help me out with this. So I took it upon myself to create this presentation. So I just wanted to mention that. I do have a graduate degree in history, and of course I'm a professional librarian, but I just wanted to say those things before I get started, that I do not claim to be an expert in Native American history. Hopefully in the future, or anyone listening to this program or watching this video, if you are or know someone who is, get them in contact with us so that maybe next year we can have experts giving these presentations. Anyways, thank you for joining us. Let us begin. Again, this topic can be and is broad, and you'll see in the slides that I present that it can go in many directions, and one can unpack and dive deeper into any of those subtopics that I will touch on. But for the most part, I'll be touching on the motivations for colonization and the development of some of the labor systems, particularly how they affected Native Americans. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, the interactions, the cultural exchanges and interactions between the Native Americans, those that were already here, the indigenous people, and as well as those that came in contact with the Spanish colonists. Okay, that's what this presentation is about. And I'll show a bibliography at the end for all my resources that I've used. But some of these slides do have, like in this one, a statement of where the information is coming from. I think it's important, as always, especially those that may not be aware of this history, that there are some key terms to consider And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the terms that I felt would be important to know at the beginning. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I think I touched upon this in a previous presentation. And by the way, the library has a website where all our recordings are housed. So when I mentioned something like that in my previous presentation, that's what I'm referring to, is this webpage that we have. And that's where we put all of the library presentations on. I'm not going to go into what Latino or Hispanic means. There's a couple of definitions out there that are floating, but I thought the Treaty of Tordesillas is an important key term to know because some people can get confused with Hispanic and Latino encompassing all of South America or all of Central America and parts of North America, but yet you have places like Portugal. I'm sorry, you have places like Brazil, and there may be some other countries too in South America where they don't speak Spanish. It's Portuguese. So this treaty pretty much during the exploration back in the 15th century allowed the demarcation between the two countries, the two European countries, as well as their possessions, if you may, in the New World. The encomienda system is a labor system that the Spanish brought over and utilized on the native people here in the Americas. It was a labor system. There's a caste system. I think India is a country and a place known for a caste system, but the Spanish also had a caste system. I won't get too deep into this, but there's a little definition there in this slide about it. Actually, I do have another slide. I take that back. It's a graphic on the caste system that the Spanish used. And it primarily had to do with the degree of Spanish blood, right? That determined one's Spanishness. Bartolomé de las Casas was a Spanish priest who criticized the Spanish treatments of indigenous peoples here in the Americas. There's this thing called the white legend versus a black legend. I'm not going to go into that except to say that there were, even back then, people who felt Spanish's treatment of the natives was less than acceptable. So this man stood out, and I think he actually even wrote a book, if not letters criticizing the crown for doing so. So I think that's important to know. And then the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, we'll talk about that. So these are just some of the terms. I'm sure there's many more, but I felt these were the most important ones that we should be aware of as we go through this presentation. So I told you about the Spanish colonial caste system, and this graphic kind of tells you where everyone fell in, right? You had the peninsulares. Those were people from the Spanish peninsula up at top. And then everything below that was just a matter of degree of your affiliation with Spanish blood, if you may. So you have the criollos, and those were the offspring, and then you had your mestizos, and those were the ones that intermarried from that Spanish offspring with Indian or Native American peoples. And then down at the bottom, you have the Indians and slaves. So kind of gives you a picture of where everyone stood back then during this time. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Southwest history, particularly with New Mexico, which is where we're at, and I mentioned this in a previous presentation about the Anasazi and the Mogollon. These were the prehistoric peoples that lived in this region, this area, this vast area encompassing Sonora, Mexico, Chihuahua, of of course, New Mexico, as I mentioned, West Texas, parts of Texas, Arizona. And so my point here is to say that there were people already here living. And so I think it's interesting and important to recognize these two cultures, the Anasazi and the Mogollon. The Anasazi is ancient cultures, and many of the present Native Americans, again, I'm not an expert, but from what I've read and understand, many, I think it's the Navajo, consider themselves descendants of the Anasazi, particularly. So wanted to highlight this. And here's a picture and a graphic representation of what I just mentioned about the Southwest and many of these locations that these prehistoric peoples lived and roamed historically. So, but of course, my presentation is going to be on the Native Americans in the United States primarily. The two themes that are ever present throughout the history of Native Americans and their interactions with the Spanish are survival and adaptability. Okay, those are the two major themes that I've concluded, and I think are common knowledge that the Native Americans have withstood, have survived, and have adapted, as one author pointed, against the changing regimes of European authority, including the republics of the United States and Mexico. And you're wondering, well, why Mexico if we're talking about the United States? Well, parts of the Southwest used to, before 1848, belong to Mexico. So there's overlap with that. Spanish presence and some Native Americans, the Comanche and the Apache in the Southwest. In the late 18th century, the Spanish Empire needed to revitalize and gain control of the Native Americans. As you can imagine, the natives, and you know the story, when they encountered colonists, it wasn't like the Thanksgiving mythology of friendliness and sure, welcome and have what we have here for you and that sort of thing. Many times there was a dispute, there was controversy, and there was fighting and violence. So the Spanish Empire needed to revitalize and gain control of the Native Americans. There was a lot of fighting. So they enacted a series of reforms. They amounted to an increase in Spanish military presence throughout the region to force the Apache, the Navajo, and the Comanche to submit and end their raids. Many of the colonists, you know, when they set up shop in these lands that were new to them, experienced raids from these peoples, and these peoples were simply reacting to, right, people trespassing on their lands. So they were very good at having raids on their settlements. So the Spanish were reacting to that. The primary outcome was a shift in the balance of power among the Native American tribes. The Comanches grew and expanded while the opposite occurred to the Apache. As a result, the Apache ended up in southwestern Texas, southern New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico, also known as La Gran Apacheria. Part of the shift in Apache lands meant that the eastern Apache, those from Lipan, Jicarilla, and Mescalero, no longer could hunt buffalo, their main source of protein, and this resulted in more raids for their survivability. Okay, so we're seeing already tensions grow, fighting and buffalo and raiding, and all in the context of survivability and reaction to colonists, and this begins quote unquote cultural exchanges. The Morning Wars. So I think one of the things that is important to understand is the difference between how the Europeans viewed things and implemented policies, so to speak, versus how the indigenous people or the Native Americans viewed. The Native Americans, yes, it's true. They all did not get along, the various tribes. There was fighting, but they also had a different modus operandi, if you will, on how they took care of business. So the Morning Wars is an example of this. Let me explain. So in retaliation for the increased raids, the Spanish launched a series of violent attacks on the Apache. However, no amount of cruelty could contain the Apache. There were never enough soldiers to pursue them, and local Spanish settlers routinely violated regulations by continuing to trade with them. Sometimes it was simply to regain livestock, but there were also many alliances formed. Many of these alliances were brokered by Spanish people that had been kidnapped and adopted into the Apache tribes. This is reminiscent of the Morning Wars done to rebuild populations. The withdrawal of Apache people further south left the Comanche in charge. They were the most powerful commercial and military presence in the area. The French's loss of sovereignty in 1763 didn't have much impact on the Comanche's trade networks, as the Spanish retained long-established French traders at their posts to combat the creeping power of the British east of the Mississippi. Trade continued, though, to be successful. That new French trade centers were established as late as 1764. The Morning Wars were low intensity, low casualty conflicts or blood feuds that produced a self-perpetuating cycle of violence that was broken only at irregular intervals so that exchanges of prisoners might be arranged. The Indians, the Native Americans, the indigenous people, when they had conflicts with other tribes, they didn't decimate them. They didn't obliterate each other. There was some sense of respect for life. And so the Morning Wars, were battles where they did not necessarily kill off each other 100%. And instead, they used the captives to broker and improve relationships. So I think this is a good example to kind of contrast the experiences, how the indigenous, the native peoples did business with each other before, and in contrast with how that happened with the colonists, particularly the Spanish. Trading and raiding in New Mexico. The Comanche were dominating trade in the plains and in the Southwest. Everyone wanted to trade with them, particularly the Spanish colonists, who were far removed from European commercial trade networks. Although the Spanish government recognized the value of trade with the Comanche, they desperately wanted to regain the upper hand over relationships with them and other raiding peoples like them. In an effort to dominate trade and therefore the native peoples, so the Spanish began flooding the market with trade goods during the 1770s. Simultaneously, they sent additional troops and strategically relocated most of the presidios to pressure native peoples into supporting them against the Apache. This plan quickly worked in Texas, but not so well in New Mexico. The main focus of the Spanish was the pueblos, since they maintained a strong identity and separated themselves from the Apache, the Navajo, and the Comanche. Despite the Spanish affinity for the pueblos, they still needed to limit their power, though. They collected annual tribute and appointed magistrates presiding over each pueblo. Also, the Spanish incorporated the Pueblo warriors into their own army to defend the colony. So just a snippet of occurrences that you're seeing early on between Spanish colonists not necessarily following the rules, right? These rules, these laws coming out of Mexico City, perhaps, or Europe, telling them how to live. But when they live so far away on these outskirts out here in the Southwest, they continue to trade with the enemy, quote unquote. So that begins to be a problem, right? This breaking of the official policies of the crown. And then, of course, the experiences among the ratings and the Spanish, particularly in New Mexico with the Pueblo Indians. So we can't blanket all the native indigenous people as one. There are individual tribes, they are unique, they are different, they have similarities and they share common values, but let us keep in mind that they are unique and different also. Once the pueblos were secured, the Spanish pointed their attentions toward the Comanche. After killing their leader, the governor of New Mexico, Anza, managed to unify all Comanche people and get them to submit to Spanish rule in 1786. After this was accomplished, he then set his sight on the Navajo. The Navajo had remained impervious to conversion and continued to raise for livestock across New Mexico. Once they established a new homeland that protected them from raids and encroaching Spanish, they agreed to a truce during the 1780s. Now, Spanish attention turned toward the Apache. They began rewarding those who brought them pairs of Apache ears. Apache that survived raids no longer got shipped to Mexico, where many kept escaping and returning anyways, but they now went to the Caribbean. Apaches eventually agreed to cease hostilities, and the forerunner of the reservation was born. Friendly Apaches were sent to peace establishments where they were given food, tobacco, and lessons in farming and ranching. Many Apaches hated these establishments and ended up defecting. Despite this, the period from 1795 to 1815 was characterized by unprecedented peace in New Mexico and Texas. So a lot of information there. Just hopefully it provides the context that's necessary to understand. Southwest United States, the Apache. The Apache, they have many sub-tribes, or I don't know what they call them, but groups that make up the Apache and members. They're called the Chiricahua, the Jicarilla, the Lipan, the Mescalero, the Mimbreño, the Nindaje, Salinero, the Plains, the Western Apache. Cousins of the Navajo or Dene. They share the Southern Athabascan languages. Their headquarters are located in Oklahoma, the Plain Apaches, and the federally recognized as the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma. And then, of course, there's Texas, and there's reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. The Apache Nation are politically autonomous. They speak several different languages and have distinct cultures. The Apacheria is their geographical region that includes eastern Arizona, northern Mexico, like I said, Sonora and Chihuahua, New Mexico, western Texas, and southern Colorado. They fought against the invading Spanish and Mexico peoples for centuries. They are known to be fierce warriors and skillful strategists. Here is the roaming grounds. Apache de Navajo, or otherwise known as Navajo, or people in the Shaman region. Apache was also used for Comanches, Mojaves, Hualapais, and Yavapais, but they do not speak Apache languages. The true llanero, or plain dweller. They were nomadic and travelers throughout the continent. The Apache Wars were fights between gold miners and the Apache near Santa Rita Mountains. The United States concept of a reservation was unknown to the Spanish, Mexicans, or any of the neighbors. And we'll talk about that shortly. They consistently are misrepresented as irresponsible caricature and exaggeration. The Apache, they were consistently misrepresented. The US government took Apache children from their families so they could be adopted by white Americans in special programs. This is an article that kind of illustrates and highlights the quote unquote civilization programs that were implemented all on the Native Americans to assimilate, right? So this particular article is called "The Fight Over Native Americans Adoption," is more about than just children. It's a current article on the present day of adoption and the uniqueness that entails adopting children and of Native American heritage. You can read there, it says the government's goal was assimilation, but they are embedded in a society where the overriding belief is that Indian families can't take care of their children. By the time the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978, between 25 and 35% of all Native American children had been removed from their parents, and 85 to 95 of those children were living in non-Native homes. The use of boarding schools was used to civilize Native Americans. One infamous federal program called the Indian Adoption Project resulted in hundreds of Indian children in Western states being removed from their parents and given to white families, often several states away. This and other programs like it lasted for about 20 years, starting in the 1950s. Parents were often pressured to give up children, while others had children taken away because everything from poverty to single motherhood was called abuse. The Comanche are located in northwest Texas, eastern New Mexico, southwestern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, western Oklahoma, northern Chihuahua, Mexico. They are known as the Comanche Nation, lords of the plains. The Comancheria is their homeland, the areas they defended. You may know them famously. Many soldiers from the Comanche were used as code talkers during World War II because of their languages were foreign to the enemies during World War II and could not be deciphered. So you may know a couple of movies with that name and topic. This is the geographical region of the Comanche. They are excellent horsemen. The use of horses brought over by the Spanish allowed them to evolve as excellent horsemanship. Among their feats of riding, here's an example. One author writes about how skilled they were in riding and fighting with horses. Among their feats of riding, there is one that has astonished me more than anything of the kind I have ever seen or expected to see in my life. A stratagem of war, learned and practiced by every young man in the tribe, by which he is able to drop his body upon the side of his horse at the instant he is passing, effectually screened from his enemy's weapons, as he lays in a horizontal position behind the body of his horse, with his heel hanging over the horse's back, by which he has the power of throwing himself up again and changing to the other side of the horse if necessary. In this wonderful condition, he will hang whilst his horse is at fullest speed, carrying with him his bow and his shield, and also his long lance of 14 feet in length, all or either of which he will wield upon his enemy as he passes, rising and throwing his arrow over the horse's back, or with equal ease and equal success under the horse's neck. So, cultural exchange of the Spanish bringing over horses and the Native Americans utilizing that is this is the example of cultural exchanges between them. The situation among the Pueblos in New Mexico was a bit different. There were still few Americans in the area, and those that came through were often absorbed into the native communities. However, after 1820, they suffered from the negligence and oppression of a distant Mexican government. However, they did benefit from the lack of migrants and only supported 19,000 non-Indians by 1800. This way of life changed after the Mexican independence in 1820. The Mexican government declared all Pueblo peoples citizens of Mexico, and like in California, their missions were to be disbanded and the class Indian no longer existed. The Pueblo people didn't really like this at all, and of course, eventually failed. Interactions with Native Americans. This is from the Khan Academies. Spanish colonizers attempted to integrate Native Americans into Spanish culture by marrying them and converting them to Catholicism, although some natives adopted some aspects of Spanish culture, others rebelled. The Pueblo Revolt was one example of a successful Native American effort to reclaim their religious practices, culture, and land. In 1680, there was a Pueblo Revolt. The Spanish arrived decades earlier and took charge of the pueblos, who had various locations throughout the states. And of course, with their harsh labor system, almost slavery, and their indoctrination of assimilation, the pueblos revolted. So in 1680, a leader by his name of Popé, also known as Popé's Rebellion, was an uprising of the indigenous Pueblo people against the Spanish colonizers, mostly in the provinces of Santa Fe in New Mexico. The Pueblo Revolt killed 400 Spaniards and drove the remainder 2,000 settlers out of the province. That's why we have Isleta del Sur Indian reservation in El Paso. Because of this revolt, there was an offshoot of the Isleta that exists today in Albuquerque. So when this revolt happened, the Spanish were driven out of the Santa Fe region, and many continued down south to present-day El Paso. And that's why we have an Isleta del Sur tribe down there. But 12 years later, the Spanish reconquered. So a little history about this is the Hopi tribe. They were the only, according to my research, the only Native American tribe that the Spanish were unable to conquer. They joined the Pueblos of New Mexico during the revolt. And as I mentioned, 12 years later, when the Spanish reconquered, they were unable to penetrate the Hopi. In 1701, the Hopi attacked the Awatovi, who sympathized with the Spanish. And the Spanish never again messed with the Hopi again. So I thought this was important. As a result of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Spanish did not return the original vicious practices like the encomienda, the mission roll, and the punishment. The Franciscans were now forbidden from entering traditional kivas or interfering with ceremonies. Pueblo peoples followed their own leaders and had more autonomy overall. So some consequences of this. I took some quotes from various resources on the following slides that I wish to read to you, just to give you bits and pieces of some overarching themes and conclusions of this presentation, and the Spanish ultimate mission, the Spanish's ultimate mission to civilize many of the Native Americans here in North America. According to the Oxford Companion of the United States History, the Spanish mission failed because the Indian people never genuinely converted to the Spanish ways. Transforming them into Hispanicized and loyal subjects of the Spanish crown failed as well. Unlike New England, where Indians were killed or displaced in order to open lands for European settlements, New Spain or Mexico sought to use the Catholic Church to evangelize the Indians and make them into gente de razón, otherwise known as people of reason. Spanish-speaking Catholic peasant farmers who followed Euro-Christian practices of work and sexual discipline. Ideally, the mission would instruct the Indians in European ways and religious beliefs. The Presidio would protect priests and the neophyte Christians from adversaries and rebellions, and the Hispanicized Indians would join the settlers in the Pueblo. Continued. In the 18th century, especially after 1750, New Spain fostered settlements of New Mexico by a system of mercedes, or land grants, given to prestigious individuals or groups of more humble status. This approach fostered a respect for Pueblo lands and also increased tension with Navajo and Apaches. In these villages, bonds of God parentage, work on the acequias and the penitentes provided social cohesion within a pattern of dispersed settlements. In New Mexico and Arizona, the ability of the still vibrant Puebloan people to compartmentalize Catholicism and their native beliefs to deflect further intrusion into their lifeways and to adapt to modern politics and work has produced remarkable cultural survival. I think that is important to understand. Given the history that has occurred and the many centuries that have passed, they are still with us today. I mentioned earlier about the gray areas between Mexico and the United States, and mainly it was because of the border that changed when Mexico lost many of the possessions it had in present-day United States Southwest. The Treaty of Guadalupe was the treaty that solidified the new borders, but there were controversies, according to one source, of the loss and change in territories. Okay, what this did, according to this author, is that it forced to merge and blend the Euro-American culture. Okay, the U.S. was then considered to be the occupied Mexico. It asked its residents to choose or leave or stay. It asked its residents to choose to either leave or stay. Leave because it's no longer Mexico, it's the United States, or stay and become citizens of the new country. Most stayed, thus choosing to be American, quote unquote. We'll talk about Indios Barbaros, but I think one thing that is important to know is that most indigenous people were considered Mexican citizens. The previous slide mentioned that too, right? That Mexico had declared all pueblos as citizens of Mexico. So you have this factor of the government, at least in Mexico, implementing policies that ignore the indigenous people's native identity and culture and land. But they persevere, right? They persevere, they survive, they resist. When Spanish explorers arrived in the early 16th century, they found the Anasazis living in 75 villages spread across the northern New Mexico and northern Arizona. I'm sorry, this should have been on the previous slide where I mentioned, in the beginning of the presentation, where I mentioned the Anasazis. But the horse, sheep, cattle, firearms, metal tools, and the printed word, typhoid, measles, and smallpox. They also brought a highly developed colonial bureaucracy, a formal set of town planning ordinances, a social class system, and the Catholic faith. So this slide should have been at the beginning of the presentation. Kind of gives you some information about the effects of Spanish colonial colonization on Native Americans. Indios Barbaros. By 1759, when Carlos III, the most America-oriented of Spain's enlightened kings, ascended the throne and initiated the so-called Bourbon reforms, many Spaniards throughout the empire resented and were embarrassed by the outdated Black legend that depicted their 16th century conquest of Mexico and Peru as overly cruel and bloody. Therefore, the Spanish crown launched a counteroffensive designed to draw attention to the millions of Indians who had been incorporated inhumanely into the empire. The Spaniards also turned their attention to the unconquered autonomous Indians on the fringes of the empire, whom they called Indios Barbaros, and attempted to gain control of those peripheries throughout the establishment of peaceful relations with the independent tribes. So if you don't know, Indios Barbaros They're just barbarians, basically. These Indians that the Spanish have not civilized or come into contact with through the implementations of their policies, right? They're on the fringes. They call them Indios Barbaros. They're uncivilized. And so that should give you an inclination of how they viewed Indians in general, and how they use them to manipulate, right? Those that they did have under their control. So that's a little explanation about the Indios Barbaros and how the Spanish viewed them. Some more. Oh, this is a repeat. I'm sorry. In the 18th century, and especially after, this is repeat too. Oh, in the 18th century, and especially after the 1750, New Spain fostered settlements of New Mexico. I read this already. In New Mexico and Arizona, the ability of the still vibrant Puebloan peoples to compartmentalize Catholicism and their native beliefs to deflect further intrusion of the lifeways and adopt modern politics and works has produced a remarkable cultural survival. I think I mentioned this already. I'm sorry. So in conclusion, Spanish influences increased, forced Indians to survive throughout the changing regime of European authority. They are their own peoples. Many do not, and rightfully so, consider themselves Hispanics, but with offspring, it's an individual choice. Where does this leave us? Spain strengthens with the lessening threat from France and Britain, but native people are aware of their limits and use them to their advantage. Spain is now extending up the West Coast, and native peoples in all areas of the South and West have to survive throughout the changing regimes of European authority to the republics of the US and Mexico. So this concludes my presentation. Again, it's a lot of history. It's a lot of years, a lot of centuries, but the idea is that there were cultural exchanges and there were many experiences that led to abuse, but also to the systems of policies that the Spanish brought in terms of their encomienda system and their labor system and their city planning system that we still see evident today. So in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day and Hispanic Heritage Latinx Month, I thank you for joining us in today's presentation, and I hope to see you on Wednesday. We will culminate this program. If you are in Las Cruces, we invite you to our campus at the East Mesa here on Sonoma Ranch. From 3 to 5 p.m., we will have music, dancing, coffee, and pan dulce to culminate this month of Latinx and Hispanic Heritage Month. Hopefully you can join us. Thank you very, are there any comments? Are there any questions? I do not see any. Thank you all very much for joining us. Have a good rest of your week.